Sat Yoga is the radical reunion of the self with itself. A conscious recognition of that which has always been the case, but it has not been recognized consciously, even though it has always been known in the superconscious. And so it is this meeting of the I as awareness that has been functioning within the phenomenal plane through body and through the intelligence of the ego mind that uses that intelligence and willpower to turn back upon itself, to rediscover its own source, its own noumenal essence that is within and beyond the phenomenal manifestation of itself. So the I, as the awareness that has entered the world, identified at least in part with mind and body, returns to that essence that has never been identified with mind or body, and has never entered into the illusion of time or space, or of change, or of difference, or of suffering. And so the attention, as it re-enters into that sphere of pure luminous presence, there comes a meeting that instantaneously produces Sat Chit Ananda. It produces the realization of our true nature, our being, Sat. It produces an emanation of the full intelligence of the self. And it produces the Ananda, the bliss, that has always been there at the deep level, but now it is connected to the surface, to the phenomenal, so that the energies of the bliss, the love, the joy, the light, the power, the wisdom, enters fully into the phenomenal plane through the linking that is made in that meditative return to presence without the intermediate barrier of thought or emotion or image or identification with anything other than itself. And so that is why the first mantra is Aham Aham, the I of awareness meets the I of the substratum and all-encompassing presence that underlies and pervades the cosmos and transcends the cosmos. And the immanent and the transcendent aspects of the self become one. They were never different, but there had been an illusion of difference because there had been a forgetting by that aspect that entered into the dream field of the phenomenal world of its true nature. And in its remembrance of its true nature, the opening of all of its potentials again happen, and they are activated and manifested, and then suddenly everything is different than it ever had been for the ego. And that difference, which paradoxically is the realization of sameness, the realization that all of its beliefs in differences were incorrect, because everything and everyone is a manifestation of that same essence that one discovers internally as the innermost self. It is also realized as the outermost and the all-encompassing and all-ever-present self, as a single intelligence choreographing all that is, and as it unfolds in its perfection, reveals to itself in the form of your own consciousness the insights and the intuitions that enable a further unfoldment of ever deeper realization that is transmitted morphogenetically through the entire field, and that superorganismic potentiality becomes gradually realized in the fullness of all of the implications of our unity in difference, of that underlying perfection. And that is what allows all of the remaining residue of Maya, of alienation, of fear, of desire, of all of the judgments and projections made by the ego mind to fall away once and for all. So one of the things that becomes an important realization is that the apparent difference between classical Advaita and neo-Advaita is not a true differential either. In the classical mode of analysis and practice, there has to be effort made by the awareness that is still identified with the body and the ego mind in order to try to overcome its difference from itself and its sense of being at a lower level of purity, of truth, of reality, and of intelligence, etc., etc. And that effort has to be made to overcome the ego resistance to its own death, to its own transcendence. But the neo-Advaitans say, with an actually logical case that needs to be understood, that because the ego is an illusion, how can an illusion make any effort? There might be an apparent effort that is made, but because there really is no ego, there's a belief in the ego, a kind of a bootstrapping of a fantasy, that because it gets believed in, that belief then produces the illusion of a reality, right? It's very cliche now that I will see it if I believe it. And so the power of consciousness working through a set of false beliefs produces a false illusion of reality. But in truth, because it is false, no effort is actually made. And no effort can be made because there is only an illusion, a mirage, and that mirage has no power to change itself. It is a fantasy structure in itself. And so what has to be understood, but isn't understood until it has been transcended, another catch-22 we could say, is that nothing is really under the control of the ego, because the ego is not real. But it's also true that the realization that nothing is under control is not under control either. And so a moment will come when the transcendence of the ego happens. That moment may come because, seemingly because of a lot of effort that's being made. I'm going to meditate for hours on end, and I'm going to fast, and I'm going to pray, and I'm going to do all kinds of service, or whatever is in one's mind, 108 repetitions of a mantra, or 108,000 or whatever. I'll not stop in that effort, and then there's a breakthrough, or maybe not. But the effort did not cause the breakthrough. Just because it may be contiguous in time does not create causality. And so when it happens, will be simply the will of that which is always already liberated and is the dreamer of the dream. The one in the dream, the character in the dream, cannot control what happens in the dream. But that character, because it's unreal, what it can know is that all of its beliefs about itself and about the world are false. But it cannot change them. it can know it, and it can even say, yeah, I know this isn't real, but I still feel this way, or I'm still going to do this thing. And it will, nonetheless, regardless of whatever amount of information or wisdom that it gains from reading sacred texts or of whatever other sources it has gained, will not help it to change in any way. That will depend upon the will of that absolute intelligence that underlies everything. And so, through the radical paying attention to one's mind in meditation, the recognition that the awareness that is paying attention to the mind cannot really change the mind. And the thought that it can change the mind is just the mind itself thinking that. But the awareness does not have control over its own mind so long as there is still identification with the body through which that mind is functioning as the operating system. And whatever thoughts, whatever inspirations, whatever ideas and behaviors and intentions and feeling states and desires occur are beyond the power of the ego to control. There may be some sense that one can keep from acting out a certain desire, or one can try to manage one's emotions, or one can try to delay the gratification of a certain urge. But even that will depend upon the will of that source. You may or may not be able to do what you intend to do. You can make all the great resolutions in the world. You can take vows with all the sincerity that you can muster. But it won't make a bit of difference if the will of that ultimate intelligence is not for you to be able to keep that promise to yourself or to another. It is all about the karmic unfoldment of the dream in which one is a character that therefore has no power to change the dream because it's only an appearance. And even the unfoldment of that appearance is an illusion because time itself is not real. And so whatever ways in which things unfold will create whatever illusions based on the false beliefs that are held in the mind of that ego, but they will have no effect on the unfoldment of reality. They are simply part of it. But at that moment when the return happens, the reconnection, when the circuit is reopened and the power flows and the I meets the I, Aham Aham, at that moment there is the emergence of Satchidananda, and that changes everything. So the first mantra, Aham Aham, I am I, the two aspects of awareness meet and the self is complete, produces the Satchitananda, and that produces peace and silence and well-being and order at all the levels of reality, from the supreme to the subtle to even the physical level of being. But it is all a result of the emanation and the explosion, you could say, of this atmic energy that comes from the meeting, the fusion of the I with the I am with the I that is beyond amness, beyond being. And the one in the being or the becoming of the phenomenal plane meets that which never enters into the phenomenal plane, but which recognizes what has seemed to be a world of multiplicity of beings and entities in processes in time and space is really just consciousness, one single consciousness at play with itself, lila. And that play, that enjoyment of its own internal potentialities and its own manifestations of every variety of beauty and of unexpected, unprecedented, unpredictable, undecidable actions that create insights, that create aha moments, eureka moments, moments of awe, moments of sublime appreciation of divine beauty and perfection. All of those incredible moments in which the ego mind is able to transcend its normal paradigm of reality and see all as it really is, subspecie eternitatis, to use Schopenhauer's phrase, in eternity rather than in time. All of that capacity for having those satoris, those moments of awakening, those realizations of bliss that can be lost as well, and there is no way to control whether one stays in that state and is permanently liberated, or one bobs up and down from Maya into Lila. But all of this is part of the play that happens as a result of the unfoldment that must happen according to the supreme intelligence of the Source. And so what can be known in that moment of Satchidananda, even if it's an extremely short, momentary glimpse, if there is a fusion between these two aspects, the noumenal and the phenomenal aspect of the self in meditation, that Satchidananda will produce an awakening whose traces will remain through time, even if the vibrational frequency of that level of consciousness has been lost and one falls back into a lower state. That frequency remains as something that can be returned to and as something that is able to recontextualize one's life, because now one has glimpsed that which is transcendent and undeniable, more real than the reality that the ego might return to in its daily life. But there's no control even of that desire to stay connected. But the emanation of that power will make its way through all the levels of reality. But it's in this moment in which everything is revealed, because nothing is hidden, because the self is the author of all that appears. And so in that moment when nothing is hidden, there is an ability to let go of all of one's demands that reality be a certain way, or fear that it will be a certain way, and all of the pathologies of the ego that have seemed to be unmovable, unshakable. You can't get rid of them. You can't change them. They're haunting you. They're causing you to fall back into a dark place, a black hole again and again. All of those tendencies of the particularity of identification of the ego lose their power over you. It's at that moment that there is freedom of the will to refuse to go back into the illusion, even though the illusion continues. But because of one's being present to the illusion, if that moment, in that very moment of fusion, there is a decisive liberation from any desire to return to the ego, then that will overcome the otherwise irresistible gravity of the attention returning and re-identifying with body and ego mind. But it can't be forced. It's grace. And if that grace occurs, then everything is different forever. And so there is no one to bring about transformation or transcendence. There's no power to change your beliefs about reality. They may change in accord with what you learn. Everything that we learn changes the paradigm to some extent. It adds a new piece of information that recontextualizes the value of all the other information. But the most important information you can take is that you are not the ego. You are not the one who feels about yourself a certain way, whether you believe that you are good or you believe you're evil, whether you believe you're beautiful or ugly, that you are an asset or a liability, whether you are pure or toxic. Whatever are the beliefs that you have about the ego, those beliefs can fall away by themselves, because at that moment of fusion there is no one to hold up those beliefs. And you can know, even after you lose the present consciousness of the illusion, that it is an illusion. And so there becomes a margin of presence that doesn't any longer have to be taken down by an ego thought or emotion that would otherwise bring depression or anxiety or some other pathological reaction to an event that was not in one's control, or in which one failed oneself, or believes that one betrayed oneself, or believes that one fell back into an addictive process, or in some objectifying process of degrading the other, or feeling a projection by the other that degrades oneself. Any of these kinds of reactions that the ego has are recognized as its own fantasy, and that it has no way to reach you in order to hurt you, and it has no reality that can affect who you are or how the unfoldment of reality proceeds. And so there is a kind of immunity, a psychic immune system strengthening that enables one to live one's life with much less need for the approval of the other, much less fear of rejection or abandonment, much less need for interpersonal interaction. But there can be a giving and a sense of one's participation in reality at a higher level than simply egoic collusions or alliances or other kinds of interactions of the more superficial kind that egos tend to engage in, but instead an engagement with that wholeness of being that can be seen within every being. And so the world becomes transparent. Its phenomenal aspect gets washed out, and one has a kind of X-ray vision that sees through to the inner light, and the unity in which this unified field acts in perfect harmony with itself at every level. And therefore there is no longer a sense of things happening as glitches or mistakes or errors, or this is someone's fault, or someone should be blamed for this or that, because everything has to unfold in exactly the way that it does. And that gives a margin for acceptance and for unconditional love and forgiveness and mercy on oneself when the glitch seems to be caused by one's own failure or ignorance or inattention. All of these phenomenal events can be observed from a place of deeper attention. And that deeper attention and awakening, which although it's not under control, because it has happened as a result of a fusion with the source, it has a tendency to produce an ever stronger sense of wakeful presence that overcomes and overrides the ego's tendency to put itself down or put the other down or have some kind of judgment in which someone has to be wrong or bad or rejected or in some way condemned, let's say, by the ego's need to be free of a projected aspect of its own being that it has condemned. And through that reunion with a part of oneself at a psychological level that one had demonized, and one can bring that back into the light through unconditional forgiveness, then there is even more power of presence to overcome the next challenge or the next moment when a projective identification emerges in the mind and one feels a sense of a conflict and a sense of being exploited or of being treated in a way that is insulting or slighting or in some way ridiculing. All of these false judgments that produce 90% of our suffering are seen as total illusions that are based on a narcissistic demand that the ego be seen a certain way, and at the same time a superego attack that keeps one from accepting who one is at that level that one wishes the other would see one as, because one doesn't believe in that level of one's purity of being oneself. So this dyadic game that the ego plays with itself as a superego falls away, and then the reality of the apparent differences of beings are smoothed out in a recognition and resonance with the essence in which we are all the same, all one, all perfect, all beautiful, all manifestations of the same blissful self. And so although this cannot be controlled by any individual, it is a fact that now that supreme power wants to bring this into being, is bringing it, doesn't have to want it. It is a wave of change that's happening in the world that is moving people to change their lives in ways in which they might not have been able to even imagine in the past. And their eyes open to the acceleration of change in the world that is shifting everyone's sense of reality into one of shock and awe of the groundlessness that we are now enduring, and that we can no longer deny, because everything we took for granted and depended on as being reality that will be here tomorrow and the next day no longer can be taken for granted. And so as more and more of these aspects of the phenomenal reality that we thought were certainties, a sure bet, fall away, and we lose that which we were attached to, that which we projected we could be sure of and that we cannot, there also comes a compensating power of solitude and independence that enables us to let go of that certainty on the phenomenal plane, because we now will have greater certainty that we are noumenal beings who are dreaming the phenomenal plane, and therefore not at risk because the dream is now producing avalanches and floods and millions of horsemen of the apocalypse. And none of these shifts of the apparent world have any effect except an enjoyment of the beauty that one recognizes pertains to death as well as to birth. And one recognizes that death and birth are a couple who come together. And that when a civilization or a world is about to die, then a new world comes into being to replace the old. And the two processes happen simultaneously. The terminally ill old civilization dies slowly and gradually in fits and starts, and with denial and pretense that everything is okay and all we need is a little more quantitative easing and we'll be fine, or we'll do this geoengineering and we'll deal with climate change, or we'll deal with all of these things with our technological prowess. And then, of course, the impossibility of that and the realization of the lack of intelligence of those political elites that would have to create all of these changes, who have no will or imagination or vision to do it. And the recognition that would otherwise produce dismay and despair now become realizations that the death will happen more quickly and the suffering beings will be put out of their misery, but a new world will come to take the place of the old, and those same beings who seem to be suffering will be able to also recognize the blissful, eternal beauty of existence as manifestations of divine perfection. And so the shifting, the continental collapse into the ocean of certain land masses and population masses and masses of energy and belief will disappear, and others will emerge from the depths. And all of these changes that are producing a birth of a new world that is ever more beautiful than the one that is dying and needs to die for its own sake and the sake of all who are part of it, is not a horror, is not something to feel despair or sadness or terror about, but is a natural process, just as every death and every birth is. But it's also a supernatural process because it is being guided by that cosmic intelligence of which we are parts, of which we are manifestations. And as we are awakened to that, we become very powerful and effective catalysts to shift all of those beings who are identified with what is dying to become re-identified with what is being born, and to take away their pain and terror and dread and turn it into joy and love and bliss, because this is a time to celebrate, not to mourn. And it's in that celebration of the shift from one age to another, from one cycle of time to another, from one type of reality to a higher and more beautiful kind of reality that we are participating in and co-creating and being created by at the same time. And it's that immense, awesome, unimaginably incredible transformation that is being accomplished through an intelligence that we can't even understand, that most of us don't even realize exists, and that is the puppeteer that is moving us through life, is bringing us to the awakening to the fact that the puppet is not who we are, but that all along that self that is pulling our strings is the real I, that you are already in this moment. Namaste. Okay, floor is open if anyone wants to comment on that or ask any questions. Mm-hmm.
I guess the main thing that comes up over and over again is when you talk about seeing the perfection and the seeming imperfection, that the ego is going to appropriate that, and somehow I need to also accept that that's perfect as well.
Mm-hmm.
It's not going well. It seems like there's a reaction to that.
What's the reaction?
I guess the question is the ego always going to appropriate all of the teachings?
Well, I think the teachings are causing the ego to disappear. The teachings themselves have the power to gradually deconstruct the ego, to make the ego itself aware of its own illusory existence. And it becomes more and more transparent to itself as a narrative fiction. And that which the ego thought it will realize it never really was. And all of its attachments and loyalties and beliefs and expectations about reality will be easily let go of, and the real self will become that power that is operating the body and the mind. So that there will be this very gradual transition in a way that your ego itself can't calculate and calibrate as it's changing. But there will be a change that at some point you will recognize, oh, you don't believe in your ego anymore, and it can't appropriate that which doesn't belong to it. But even its appropriation of it was part of its imagining itself at a higher state than it was, and that very imagining was a performativity paradox that actually boosted it into that higher level of consciousness.
I guess that's the question that came up during the week. Is the performativity paradox and experiencing the virtues of God in this being actually God?
Of course, there is nothing but God. But what is not God is the ego's interpretation of it. That will always...
What scares me, this fake it till you make it is filled with all sorts of other crazy imaginary ideas.
Sure, but those ideas will have their own karmic backlash so that they won't be able to maintain themselves. And soon one won't want the suffering involved with trying to become a megalomaniac or messianic figure or whatever, and try to claim that one is whatever the ego wants to boast about, and all of the air will be taken out of that balloon by karma. So you don't need to worry about it. But the more that you pay attention to the source from which whatever the actual virtues of even your ego have, you realize that they do come from God, and because everything good does. And so revel in that, enjoy it, but let it make you more humble and more dedicated to receiving even more virtues until you realize that you are the source yourself, but not the wrong self that is part of the mental construct, but that which is supramental. Okay. Mm-hmm.
I don't have a comment or a question, but I was just going to comment that I appreciate your answer to Sat Yoga Ashram and talking about feeling deconstructed. Your teaching is deconstructing more and more, because that's just exactly how I felt tonight. It was just completely deconstructed.
Okay, good.
And it just gets more and more subtle or something. I don't know what's happening.
Mm-hmm. Right. So it's happening, but you're not making it happen. Even the teachings aren't making it happen. So there may seem to be a cause and effect relation, but it's happening because it's happening. And the will of that supreme presence that wants your intelligence to open up to your true nature and let go of the ego is effecting a transformation. So you don't have to worry about what's causing it. It's just happening because it's meant to happen.
Just be present in it happening.
The more you are present, you discover that is the happening. Because that's all the ego is a lack of presence. Because it loses itself in representations that makes it live in the past or the future. It's never present. And so presence is egolessness. And that is the self that is actually the power that's working through everyone.
You talk about in this moment of point of fusion.
Mm-hmm.
You go to I feel sometimes like a moment of that, but it's like a fear.
Yeah, the ego has the fear because it will not exist if that fusion remains. That's right. And so
But that's not it. The fear is not the fusion. The fear sort of precedes it. Right?
That's right. Sure, and it tries to prevent it. But it doesn't really have the power to prevent it, and when the fusion is meant to take place, it happens, and the fear dissolves. It has no power to override the will of God, if you want to put it into that format, but you don't need to have a religious context. It's simply the self manifesting its true nature fully. You were first, Vajra, by a half a second.
So what is the point of practice if there is no cause, only an effect that is not because of any effort?
You're going to practice anyway. If I tell you to stop practicing, you're still going to practice because you enjoy the practice. The practice brings rewards. It brings a greater empowerment. It brings all kinds of benefits. But you're not doing it because you calculated that on some hedonic scale, that this is going to be more enjoyable and that less enjoyable. You're just doing what you are inherently intended to do. So I don't need to try to convince you should practice. You know, and if you're not meant to practice, you're not going to practice, no matter how convinced you are that you should. And whatever is your destiny is going to unfold as it's intended to by that source. So ultimately, there is no practice. And as soon as there is realization of who you are, who is there to practice? That's the whole point of the neo-Advaita. There is no one to practice anything. You're already the Atman who's doing what? So the sooner that illusion is let go of, the more that the practice becomes the perfection that the practice was intended to reach, and that which is already the truth of who you are.
So you still wake up even if you never practice, if that was the will of...
That's right. Sure. Well, Ramana never practiced, but he became enlightened like that, right? He just paid attention to what was going on at that moment and took it all the way, and he's done. So that can happen to anyone. But it wasn't something he chose either. It happened to him, right? He was simply drawn into that void of egolessness, of death. And the ego was no more. And then no more decisions were ever made. Everything just happened spontaneously. And the same is really happening to you right now, but your mind doesn't recognize that. If you pay attention to the deeper self that's not the mind, you will see that there's already that state of liberation that doesn't need to practice anything. Now it's your turn.
You said that in the moment of fusion, it would produce an awakening, and a frequency will remain even if one loses that fusion. So I'm trying to understand that idea in that there are these moments of satori or complete, let's say, silence, where a frequency is reached that then eventually the ego returns and makes one drop that frequency. And yet, are you suggesting that there is I don't even know if to call it a memory, because that's...
Yeah, a memory trace of that.
Memory trace.
That's right.
Almost like a sanskara, if you wish, or a path that has been opened, that then one can purposely return to, or how does one... Because you suggest that one can then reconnect to that.
Sure, but it's not that one can, it's that it will happen. Because the trace is timeless, it is a moment, that moment of fusion brings you from time into eternity. And so that timeless presence then emanates through all time. And so you never lose it. The trace of that is always there with you. Okay? Now, it's even there before that experience, or imperience, or Sumerians, however you want to call it, happens. Before that fusion happens, it's that itself is a trace of the original fact that before you were ever born into this dream field, that's who you were and are. And even though you're dreaming that you're something or someone else, the reality doesn't change. And so that's always there. So it's not that one can change it, but that it is part of the reality that will bring the return to that state, because it's more coherent, it's more beautiful, it brings more happiness, it brings more of the final satisfaction and fulfillment of life. And so the trajectory of your life will bring you back to that source one way or another, even if it has to go through a number of downfalls at the ego level and crashing and hitting bottom in order to be able to say, okay, now I'm ready. But the return is inevitable, and the more that one has these moments of fusion or transcendent glimpses of the real, it means that the sooner one is going to return to that complete liberation in this lifetime. Okay.
So would you say, two questions, that it's you're saying it's gradual, at least in time, that one has these potentially, or one can be like Ramana and realize it in one.
Well, even that was gradual, in the sense that it started when his father died at 12, and then it happened at 16. So there was still a 4-year period, right? So I think that it's always gradual. And then if you add in the past lives in which he made a lot of effort, and it finally culminated in that one. So it's gradual in the sense of that's what time is about, is the whole process of the separation, the enjoyment of the adventures that the mind can create in a sense of separate existence from the source, and then the final desire to return, because the world itself is exhausted and barren and dying, and in seeing that, you don't want to die along with it. You want there to be some final hope of restoration or revelation or redemption, and that in itself is going to bring you back to the only hope that there really is, that is now going to manifest itself in the form of that transformation of the world that you are now a part of.
So could you say that then, going back to what you responded before, the only thing that is to be done is to be present, to be in the present?
That's the only thing that you have any will to achieve. That's right.
That's it.
Yeah.
Be present, and then there's a fusion with this.
Right. You can't even choose to be present, okay? Because you can want to be present and then still have a very bad meditation in which you weren't present, right? And darn, I couldn't stop my mind for 1 minute, and I was so sure this was the time I was going to, transcend. So you don't have control even there. But that desire, as it gets stronger and stronger, is a sign that soon you will be taken out of the misery of the egos needing to make all this effort. And the fullness of your real self will reveal itself, and you will then get to laugh at all the effort that you made, and the realization that that wasn't you at all needing to make that effort.
And it was all perfect, and that's how it had to be.
Absolute perfection. So the one thing you can take from that is, why not accept then your absolute perfection now? You can't force yourself to do that, but it could happen. Why fight it if that thought comes into your mind and enables you to let go of all the stress and the worry and the self-attacks and all of those things that the ego are producing, when none of them are true anyway?